Good morning, primary class. This is the story from the back of your lesson, Charlie and the Bridge, Part 2. After one of the back wheels of the wagon went over the edge of the bridge, the gentle old horse named Charlie stood perfectly still. That kept the rest of the wagon from falling into the water. George was very glad when some men came to help. First, let's lift that back wheel of the wagon onto the bridge, the men decided. And soon the whole wagon was back on the bridge. I was taking that bag of rye to the mill to be ground, George told the men as he pointed down at the sack of rye that had fallen into the stream. When old Charlie backed the wheel of the wagon over the edge of the bridge and the sack slid into the water. It didn't take long for the men to wade into the stream and get the bag of rye. They put it back on the wagon, but of course the rye was now wet. George had to take it back home to be dried before it could be ground into flour. George thanked the men for helping him. They watched to be sure that Charlie would behave. George drove Charlie over the bridge so they could turn back around and drive home. The gentle old horse obeyed just as he had always done. How strange, George thought to himself, as Charlie trotted back over the bridge and down the road towards home. Why had obedient old Charlie suddenly decided to do what he did on the bridge? When they got home, George told Father all about what had happened, and Father was surprised too. After unhitching Charlie and putting the wagon where it belonged, Father lifted the rye sack off the wagon. It was much heavier than when it was dry. Then Father opened the sack. Immediately he saw something that frightened him. When he showed it to George, he was frightened too. Father and George looked at each other. They both knew at once why Charlie had stopped in the middle of the bridge. They knew why he backed up until one of the rear wheels of the wagon went over the edge of the bridge. And they knew why the bag of rye slid off into the stream. All through the grain of rye were little pieces of glass. If the grain had been ground in the mill, the ground glass would have been all through the flour, and that would have been dangerous to the family. They had prayed that morning at worship time that Jesus would send his angels to protect them that day, and Jesus had answered their prayer. He had sent an angel to stop old Charlie. The angel had told Charlie to back up. He had told him to stop where the bag of rye slid off the wagon into the stream, and he had told him to stand very still so the rest of the wagon wouldn't fall off the bridge into the stream. Jesus had answered their prayer, and old Charlie had been obedient after all.